is what we're seeing in president. Now, obviously, his situation being a former president, I get we've never seen. But what we're seeing with him, generally speaking, is that the exception, or is it merely an expansion and enlargement of the corruption and failures that are happening all over this country in the legal system, number one? And number two, is it becoming harder for the idea of getting a jury of your peers? And the reason I ask you that is because Daniel Horowitz wrote in The Blaze recently that red states better start making red states as red as blue states are blue. And one of the things he talked about was saying states need to make it easier for defendants prosecuted in blue cities to assert political bias among jurors. One way might be to expand the jury pool to rope in more conservative jurisdictions so that defendants would get a more equitable selection. Give me your thoughts on all of that in general.
Yeah, so Daniel, as usual, is thinking very clearly. I went on Daniel's show actually on Friday, the day after the verdict. I've known Daniel for probably close to a decade at this point. He and I are very like mind on the overwhelming majority of all things legal and judiciary related. He's always thinking of clever solutions there. You know, I never would have thought of that particular policy remedy when it comes to expanding the jury pool, but you know, it does make a lot of sense. We live in a day and age here where America's urban centers are utterly dominated by far left actors, by Soros-funded prosecutors there. So something like extending the jury pool, if it can be written in clear form in a statute, and you know some lawyer can probably figure out how to do that and make it sound all pretty, strikes me as a good idea. Now, on the Mark Levin proposal, when it comes to trying to expedite this to the Supreme Court, look, I have a ton of respect for Mark Levin, and intuitively, I like where he's coming from. You know, this is a case of obvious great national importance. It makes a lot of intuitive sense that the U.S. Supreme Court should step in here, similar to the way they did in Bush versus Gore. There are at least two things that give me cause for concern, though. One is that it's kind of just black letter Supreme Court procedural law that they will not review a state criminal case until the highest court in that particular state has issued a final judgment. That's just the law. Now, you know, we can try to figure out a way to somehow get around that law, but it's probably not going to happen. Even in Bush versus Gore, which is not a criminal case, it was a civil case, but that ultimately got appealed from the Supreme Court of Florida. So the highest court in Florida had to reach a ruling. I think the New York Court of Appeals in New York State probably is going to have to reach a ruling as well. The second and slightly more philosophical reason why I'm not sure that it's actually a good idea to try to fast track this thing to the U.S. Supreme Court is essentially as follows. If you do that, you're basically putting all of your faith in the basket of John Roberts, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. Now, you know, maybe you're the kind of person who is like a perpetual optimist and you just have total abiding faith that the swing justices will always do the right thing. I am not one of them. I have been a pessimist on all things judicial branch related since before I even started law school over a decade ago. And if you go ahead and do that, if you expedite it to the U.S. Supreme Court, you're not really going to have a clear, clean path to then go back to Albany, the state capital of New York, and then go begging before the New York Court of Appeals. So I'd rather that Trump's lawyers skip the appellate division, which is the intermediate court of appeals in New York State, and try to go straight to the New York Court of Appeals, which is the highest court in the state of New York. And look, is it a conservative tribunal? No, obviously not. But the New York Court of Appeals, unlike the lower two rungs of courts in New York State, are not elected judges. They're advice and consent, similar to federal judges, so they don't necessarily have that direct kind of electoral accountability like you would have if you were running for office in Manhattan, like Juan Merchan is. And then on the other hand, you know, as a New York native myself, you know, recall that New York is not at least it used to not be a banana republic. I mean, this was the commercial, financial, cultural center of the Western world on a certain level here. And you have to have at least some hope, at a bare minimum, a similar level of confidence that you would have in John Roberts, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett, that these folks might do the right thing.